I'd like to thank the Seattle Metals Guild for the invitation to present at this year's event, the 25th Annual Symposium. I'd love to be in Seattle with you and the other presenters, but I appreciate that we can be together for this online version. So thank you for tuning in. Again, let's get started. Time and materials. It's a standard phrase in a contract for construction, product development, etc., and it's also the title of my talk. I went to the University of Akron in Ohio to get a degree in engineering. But after my second year, I realized that calculus and I were never going to be friends. I knew, though, that I wanted to design and build things, so I moved into the art department and graduated in 1990 with a BFA in sculpture and metalsmithing. Looking back on this work from 30 years ago, I'm still interested in working with patterns and textures, combining materials, and creating objects that are pared down to their essential elements. After graduating, I spent the better part of a year at Penland School of Crafts, where I made my first forgings using cut nails as the starting point. In the fall of '91, I went to work at the Metal Museum located on a bluff above the Mississippi River in Memphis, Tennessee. These gates are what greet you as you enter the museum, and the person who greeted me was Jim Wallace, the museum's founding director. I spent the first half of the '90s at the Metal Museum, and I can honestly say that during those years, there is nowhere else I would have rather worked. And I learned so much more there than I can say here, but here are a few things. I learned, of course, about metalworking and its rich history. Being a Northerner, I had a lot to learn about the South. Sweet tea, yes ma'am. And I learned how to shoot a shotgun and how to cast a fly rod. I learned some things by observing, but lots more by doing. There's an amazing we can accomplish anything attitude about the museum. It's infectious and most everyone who's been there has it. They have the stories and burn marks to prove it. I've got mine and I wouldn't trade them for anything. On the left, commissioned by the city of Memphis for that year's Italian-themed cultural event called Memphis in May, is a suit of Etruscan armor we built made of forged and raised bronze. And on the right, we had some fun with Elvis before we did the restoration work on him. The first project I did on my own at the museum, though heavily influenced by Wally's Art Nouveau design sensibility, was this bench for a local school. It's 6 feet long and made of forged steel with mahogany slats. To figure out my own voice in forged steel, I would sometimes drive across the bridge over the Mississippi River and into Arkansas to visit my friend Woody Ray's farm. I drew a lot of inspiration from my work while wandering around that farm, and I began to make sculptures combining forged elements with manipulated found objects. I also drew inspiration from simple physics properties, like for every action, there's an equal but opposite reaction, and things at rest tend to stay at rest, things in motion tend to stay in motion, and this piece pivots on that central element on the wall. This 12-foot tall sculpture from '94 titled Harvest is the first time I used perforated steel plate in my work, and you can see that in the image on the right-hand side. And this is one of my first boxes from '94, '95. The image on the right shows the perforated steel forging progression that makes the box on the left. The lid is made out of forged wrought iron, which has a stringy, fibrous wood grain texture to it as a result of its manufacturing process. These two boxes show the Asian aesthetic influence on my early work. I was also looking at agricultural grain storage buildings and shaker boxes for inspiration. The handles are cutoffs from the material used to make the lids, putting into practice the idea of getting the most out of the materials, Memphis barbecue and the Southern culture of using everything but the squeal. In '96, after 5 years of working at the Metal Museum, first as 2-year apprentice and then as 3-year artist in residence, I left Memphis to get my MFA at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale in Illinois, which is where I met Cappy Cunard, our previous speaker. This box, utilizing fencing material, forge welded to plate steel and rust patinaed, is one of the first pieces that I made in graduate school. Nail box. Your MFA is your terminal degree in studio art, so I figured I'd better earn it. I was always taught that a thing worth doing was worth doing well, or as my dad put it, don't half-ass anything. This is how the lid indexes onto the box. While at Carbondale, I had 3 years to hone the Yusko fit, which is what one of my undergrad professors called the precise way that my pieces all join together. After making several boxes and wondering what function they might have, what people put in them, I went for something completely non-functional with this solid block of steel teapot. On a visit to a scrapyard near the university, I found a piece of threaded steel pipe squashed out of round and into an oval shape after being run over by a bulldozer. That inspired a series of oil cans, and I still use this forged threaded pipe in works today. This tall oil can is made from a piece of 3-inch round tubing that I packed with sand and then forged octagonally. The top piece was formed from a flat sheet of steel, and the stopper was made from a reformed piece of threaded pipe. I was experimenting with materials and trying to push myself technically with these pieces. Though none of my oil cans are particularly useful, with a forged perforated spout, this 18-inch tall one is purely sculptural. The first iteration of this 40-inch long watering can was made of tin cans in a class with at Penland, while I assisted Bobby Hansen, the tin can guru. As I added the heavier forged elements, the balance shifted and the can tipped over, which meant that I had to replace all the tin can parts with forged steel ones. And even at that, to prevent that watering can from being too spout heavy, the rubber hose handle is packed with steel shot to keep it from tipping forward. The lid on this watering can is still one of the more complicated bits of sheet forming that I'd ever done. For my thesis exhibition, I made a series of pieces designed to catch and contain ethereal and intangible elements like a thought or an idea. These pieces could be unclipped from the wall and taken out for a spin. This piece was made while thinking about the impending doom of Y2K, the year 2000, when all the ones and zeros in digital languages would stop talking with each other and the world would go dark. With this oil-filled lantern, we'd at least have light wherever we wanted to unclip it and take it with us. As a way to get out of the blacksmithing studio, I studied black and white photography at Carbondale. Out in the world with your little rectangle, as the saying goes. Photography trained me to see full frame as well as the most minute detail, and I learned so much about my metalwork through this medium. But this was in the days of film, not digital, so I kind of shot myself in the foot as I ended up in even a smaller, darker room than the blacksmith shop. This is the power plant at Carbondale. After completely dialing in my camera and learning how to make a decent negative in print, I put away the 35mm Nikon and began shooting with a medium format toy plastic camera called a Diana. The university is powered by coal, as was my forge, and I like that parallel. The photos shot with the Diana camera were then incorporated into my MFA thesis exhibition. After grad school, I moved to St. Louis to set up my studio and work at the St. Louis Art Museum, the museum with the best acronym, SLAM. One of the more challenging mount making projects I worked on while at the museum was for these totem poles from New Guinea, ranging in height from 15 to 19 feet. The mount brackets were recessed into the wall at the Pulitzer Foundation for this exhibition, which was a joint venture between the museum and the Pulitzer Foundation. One of my favorite moments at the museum was a gallery talk by painter Chuck Close, where he talked about problem creating versus problem solving. Problem solving, he said, was overrated because everyone solves the same problem. With problem creating, though, you go to your studio, you create your own problem, and then you solve it. This is somewhat semantic, but I like the idea. My own studio in St. Louis was located in the Lemp Brewery Complex, which was a series of brick buildings built in the late 18 and early 1900s. The building my studio was in was called the Condenser House, and that's the inspiration and title for this 8-foot tall sculpture. And here we see a spout detail of the forged steel connections with the rubber hose. Inspired by the interplanetary rovers Spirit and Opportunity, which landed on Mars in 2004, this piece is called Collector. And this is a detail of the wheels and the body of that vessel. This 8-foot tall piece is called Traveler, also from that same series. And this is a detail of the rotating solar panel forms that are made out of phenolic resin sheets. In 2006, I taught the spring concentration at Penland. A couple months after returning home, I left the St. Louis Art Museum to go full-time into my own studio. Unfortunately, I knew I couldn't make a living by collecting my own sculptures, so I designed a series of furniture and vessels made of steel tubing combined with forged elements. And this is the first coffee table from that series. And this 11-inch tall oil can uses the same 2-inch square steel tubing as in the previous coffee table. These are some of the first pieces from the Yellow Box series. I've made lots of these. I initially used the square and rectangular cutouts that you see on the front faces of these purely as a design element, but then realized that by using Morse code, I could use these dots and dashes for messages. So the center box has my initials, S across the top and Y going down the side there, and on this side. And on the opposite side are my wife's initials, RC, Ruth Coffey, and there's just one dash different between them, so you can see through the box. The image on the bottom shows the raw material, the threaded steel pipe that the lids are made out of. In 2007, I moved to Cleveland. This is a glamour shot of the city at night. Cleveland is home to many bridges over the Cuyahoga River as the river winds its way through the city before emptying into Lake Erie. For years, Cleveland got a bad rap, but I like it here. And the city is on the upswing. We even have nice graffiti here. The reason I moved to Cleveland was to be the artist in residence at Rose Iron Works, a 100-year-old, third-generation run blacksmith shop. This 6-foot square screen is titled Muse with Violin, and it's the quintessential example of Art Deco metalwork in the US. Rose Iron Works' first artist in residence, Paul Fayer, designed it, and Martin Rose and crew built this piece in 1930. This 46-inch tall Art Deco plant stand is one of the first pieces that I built for Rose Iron Works. I went to work for Rose primarily, though, to make pieces of my own design for them. And this is a console table made of steel, stainless steel, and corian. This detail shot shows the shaped corian hovering above the forged steel. The legs are forged from 2-inch round and are capped with stainless steel buttons. We made these complementary side tables in heights from 22 to 27 inches. On the left is a pair of catbit tongs, which is a staple product of Rose Iron Works since World War II, and the inspiration for these stainless steel coat hangers that I designed and built. They weren't very cost effective to produce, though, being cast and machined, so I came up with these butterfly hangers, which we made in steel and in stainless steel as well. They function beautifully. A jacket drapes nicely over the wing forms. Rose Iron Works has a 250-ton press, so I designed works that took advantage of that amazing squishing power. On the left is an oil lamp, and on the right is a squashed candle holder. Taking advantage of a misstrike with the press, instead of scrapping the material, I made this little one-shot teapot. Every blacksmith I know makes a bottle opener, and this is my version. In 2008, I was asked to become a member of the Board of Trustees of Haystack School, located across this bridge on Deer Isle, Maine. In 1962, Edward Larrabee Barnes designed Haystack. The campus was built to float above the ground and have a light footprint. Commenting on the Haystack campus, Fran Merritt, the school's first director, noted that the buildings are temporary, but the ideas are permanent. This is a typical building at Haystack using locally sourced materials before that was cool. I had 2 life-changing events happen to me in 2011. I married Ruth Coffey in the meadow on Deer Isle, Maine. Most of my photos of Ruthie looks like this. She really doesn't like getting her picture taken. And I received a $20,000 Creative Workforce Fellowship, which was a game changer for my studio. This is some of the equipment that I bought. I squeezed every penny out of that grant to upgrade the equipment in the studio. This is a milling machine on the left-hand side and a lathe on the right. I'd always made work with a jeweler's sense of detail, but the new equipment made it that much easier. This is called the Signal Box Trio. And this 8-inch tall vessel is titled Blue Box Beacon. The roof is made out of forge welded threaded rod. This vessel was inspired by the Japanese bento boxes and spells go in Morse code. The G is on the yellow section and the O is on the green section. This dual image shows the front and back view of the same piece titled Federal Box. For some reason, Cleveland has 3 federal buildings, and this is kind of a mashup of all 3 of them. Blue Box Sanctuary. The horizontal lines are the layout lines for Morse code, which would spell home on this side, and on the other face that you don't see, it spells away. I'm intrigued by the structure of things. The visual vocabulary of architectural elements, agricultural implements, and industrial processes tells a story. The shapes, textures, and connections of the material I use are part of that story. This table is from the Cuyahoga series and is titled Bridge. For the tabletop, I use low iron glass, which is more optically pure than regular glass and has a bluish rather than a green edge. These images show some of the details, the connections and organic forgings on the tops of the legs on the left, and on the right, you see the leveling mechanisms that's incorporated into the feet. This table is also from the Cuyahoga series, and the tabletop was, in its previous life, the fork from a pallet jack. This is my favorite bridge in Cleveland over the Cuyahoga River, and a little side table that it inspired called Double Yellow. The 1/8-inch thick yellow plates are tapered and dovetailed that fit into the 1/4-inch tabletop, and then it locks them into position. This is the Interstate 90 bridge being constructed in Cleveland a few years ago, and a table that was inspired by that bridge called Stainless Detour. The front feet were inspired by the concrete barriers between lanes on highways, and then the other back feet have levelers incorporated into them as well. And this is a detail of those pieces. That stainless plate is tapered, dovetailed, and inset into the top as well. For the fall semester of 2014, I was the Wingate Artist in Residence at Purchase College, which is part of the State University of New York, SUNY, that was founded in 1967. Edward Larrabee Barnes, the same architect who designed the Haystack campus a few years earlier, was appointed master architect for the campus design. You can see the similarity in form of the structures from the Haystack campus, though the materials are quite different. Long way home. So I was 500 miles away from home. As a resident in the furniture program, the idea was to combine vessels with the bridge-like tables that I'd been making. However, these sculptures happened instead. This piece deals with the concepts of what home means on an individual basis, as well as a more broad-based universal level. The forms used represent roadways, bridge trestles, and sawhorses. When I was a kid, every dad in the neighborhood had a set of sawhorses in the garage, and when they got dragged out, that's when the work got done. The vertical pattern of square and rectangular holes that I cut into the front of this yellow house spells home in Morse code. I'm not sure if Samuel Morse thought of this when developing his code, but the letters in home descend sequentially, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's 5 dots and 5 dashes. It's balanced but asymmetrical, poetic, and a nice metaphor for home life, I think. Transit. The concept and title of this piece derives from the noun transit, which Webster defines as a precise optical measuring instrument used in building and surveying to determine the relative position of objects and lines, and from the verb transit, which means to cause or enable to pass through or across. The design of the center element allows this piece to pivot up and down like a teeter-totter or a seesaw, depending on what part of the country you're from. The image on the left shows the 9 houses, like the blur of buildings you see when you're driving down the road. On the right, you can view through all the windows, allowing this sculpture to function as a transit would. The way things go. The concept and title of this 7-foot-long piece is inspired by the chain reaction, cause and effect performance installation of Peter Fishley and David Weiss. It's also inspired by Hot Wheel tracks we played with as kids. This detail of the way things go shows the 1/4-by-4-inch plate on top of the 3/16-by-4 plate held together with 1/4-inch rivets. The legs were forged out of 1-by-1.25 bar stock. I'm sure most of you know making complicated things look so simple. Wow, I'm sure as most of you know, making things look so simple is often quite complicated. So are these sentences. The final piece from this series, The View from Here, is from 2016. The houses are attached with 1-inch rare earth magnets and locator pins. And here we see a detail of the trestle connections in the glass house. This finely textured glass house was made from reclaimed warehouse windows. Citadel. This 20-inch long piece, and it's made out of 1/4-inch plate, and it weighs close to 40 pounds. It's the largest and heaviest vessel that I've built. Along with the previous sculptures, this piece was included in my solo Tributaries exhibition at the Metal Museum in 2016. For scale, the window cutouts are 1/8 inch by 1/4 inch. I've tried to never make a piece titled Reliquary, but this one just had to have that title. This is what's inside the steel factory. This is my contribution titled Safe House, with a question mark at the end, to Boris Bally's Imagine Peace Now exhibition, the innovative merger of art and guns to inspire new expressions. I made a museum mount for this .22 caliber long barrel pistol and enclosed it in this glass house. Sanctuary here to there. The layout lines are for Morse code lettering, spelling here on both faces of the body of this vessel, and the cutout dash is the letter T, which would make this side spell there. And here you see a shot of the bottom being tack welded in place. Eventually that's all welded, sanded, ground, and finished. I made these boxes just after the 2016 elections. The red one is titled Signal Box Empty, and those are the letters M and T in Morse code. And on the right is Blue Box Resist. And yes, those cutouts spell resist in Morse code. For the 2017 fall semester, I received a month-long artist in residency at San Diego State University. The drive across the country and back was as meaningful to me as the time during the residency. I drove fast most of the time, and I learned some new words. Along the way from Ohio, I made snowballs in August, and I took some roads less traveled in Colorado. In Utah, I hiked up Angel's Landing in Zion National Park. Amazing hike and views. And on the way home, I spent 2 days at Joshua Tree, California, which is one of the most magical and spiritual places that I've ever been, and it inspired a new body of work. During the residency, I became fascinated with the process of steam bending wood. For this piece titled Continental Divide, thin white oak strips nearly 7 feet long were steam bent like wet linguine around steel forms to create this shape. This is a detail showing the steel element squeezing the wooden strips together, and an in-process shot of steam bending the white oak around steel forms. This piece is titled Western Reserve and uses the same processes as the previous one. And this detail shows the found street sweeper bristles that I formed into a balloon shape and the milk painted oak structures that were burned on the edges to give it that dark look. I use my camera as a sketchbook. While I've never built a piece exactly like the photograph, the design direction of a piece is often inspired by what I see through the camera lens. Such is the case with this pot rack, which I built for some friends who own a local favorite of our restaurants here in Cleveland. And this detail shows how the rack attaches to the ceiling. And another detail shows that the hooks can slide between the rails there. I also use photography as a way to get out of the studio and to really look at what's around me. Last winter, I took this photograph of a merlin, which is a medium-sized falcon whose diet is primarily other birds. In photography, you have to be completely in the moment, relaxed yet focused, what French street photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson called the decisive moment. I like seeing the big picture, and I enjoy digging into the details, just like how we approach our own work. As opposed to spending a month or longer working on a sculpture, one of my favorite things about photography is the immediacy of the medium, like capturing the unbelievable precision of these Air Force Thunderbirds in a fraction of a second. And capturing that decisive moment as an F-35 nears the speed of sound and begins to develop this vapor cone. This typically happens if atmospheric conditions are right at speeds around 770 miles per hour, just below breaking the sound barrier. Thinking about cones, I developed these volcano candle holders. They're 3 inches tall and 4 inches wide at the base, and I'd like to show you how they're made. So on the left, it's a pile of parts, forged steel tubing, and on the right, you see how I flare out the tubing on the horn of an upturned anvil. The next 2 videos show you how the textures and forms are created. So I'm knocking off the fire scale, wire brushing it off, and then we'll go to the power hammer. It's not complicated tooling, that's just a 1/2 inch bar of mild steel used to texture the hot steel. I can usually get one half of the form textured in one heat. Do a little fine tuning there, flatten it out, and then back to the forge for another heat. So the hammer that I'm hitting it with is a rawhide mallet inside a cast iron head, so you've got some weight to it. Flatten it back out, and then I test it against those templates drawn on the table to make sure it's been stretched out enough. So once the piece has been cooled down, I put it into the blast cabinet and bead blast it to get the scale off, and then draw the template on and then cut it out on a bandsaw. I'm not going to show you the entire cutting out process. And then it goes into the forge to be formed into the cone shape. So I use glancing blows to tease it over the edge of the horn of the anvil there to round it into shape. So this is the second heat, doing the second half of it. So I'm not too concerned that this is a completely round shape at top and bottom. What I'm mostly concerned with at this point is getting those two edges to line up nice and tight so that I can weld them together once it's cooled down. And that's close enough where once it cools, I can TIG weld it together. So once the components are forged and formed, it's time for fitting, welding, and grinding. Subtle differences in where the welds are placed have lots of, save lots of finishing headaches. And here you see volcano candle holder components on the left and oil lamp components on the right. And then here we have the finished product. I began this vessel titled Trinity in December of 2018. Vessels become sanctuaries where observations, ideas, and experiences are kept. I'd now like to walk you through the process of developing the texture for this piece. So the pattern of this woven wire is called triple shot with 3 inches between the woven sections. The image on the left shows the material as I found it, and on the right shows it in process. After bead blasting, a section is cut out, 10-gauge steel plate is cut to fit the size of the woven wire, and then round steel rods are cut to fill in the gaps. This is all TIG welded then in preparation for forge welding. The image on the left shows the clamping system that holds the rods in place for TIG welding, and on the right shows that material in 2 stages. The first, prep for welding, and on the right side is the finished forge welded panel. And here you see the process for making the front panels and back panels, which are a little bit different than the sides. And this shows the front and back panels once they've been forge welded and then ready for their test fitting on the right-hand side. On the left, we're looking down into the top of the box with the ridge line in place and then fitting up the roof material on the right-hand side. And this is how that box opens up. Using the same forge welded panels, this piece is titled Trinity Incense Burner. The exploded view shows the 1.5 by 4.5 inch lid, which is the piece on the blue tape. And I can definitely see some future broach ideas in this. On the right, after drilling out the material in those windows, it's Optivisor and needle file time. After 20 years of working in my studio, I realized that I was burned out. Instead of a little red convertible, I bought a jet black racing bicycle, and taking some time away, I rode 1,000 miles in the month of August. I drove to Deer Isle, Maine to visit friends, work on their farm, and eat lobsters. Upon returning and with fresh eyes, I looked at the studio filled with the machines, tools, and materials and saw it as I should. The cathedral is and always has been my cathedral. This piece, titled Cathedral, is 14 inches tall and made of forged, machined, and fabricated steel, wood, glass, and silver leaf. The central rust patinaed element is inspired by the shape of the base of an anvil, and then moving up that form, I took inspiration from the forged leg of a blacksmith's post vise. And here's what's inside Cathedral: painted wood and silver leafed. And then here are those structures finished and then connected to the steel structures. And this detail shows those forms obscured into the glass steel house. Sanctuary work. This vessel pays homage to the materials that I use most in my work: steel, wood, and glass. And the square and rectangular cutouts spell work in Morse code. And this detail shows the silver leaf glass house and the textured hollow steel silo form. I began a series of material studies based on the form of cathedrals, and here you have two views of the same piece, titled Cathedral 19.04. This cathedral, the textured steel element, is 18 inches tall, and in this piece, it's 10.5 inches long total. This piece is titled Collateral Cathedral and was made for the upcoming Rhode Island's Imagines Peace exhibition. The base is made of forge welded decommissioned handguns, and I'll share with you some of the in-process photos. So step one, receive a box of decommissioned handguns from Boris Valley. I then cut apart those handguns and made my plan of how to construct a forge welded block. Some of the entire guns were forged and folded onto themselves, and the barrels and cylinders were also added to that mix. I made these V-dies for the hydraulic press to forge weld the massive guns into blocks that could, once fused together, be finished under the power hammer. On the left, blasted and ready to go into the forge, and on the right is the loosely forge welded block. And here you see those pieces forge welded together. I use a combination of the forged elements, ethafoam blocks, and soapstone drawings as I work through this design process. And here you see the forged steeple cooling down after the final forging, filing, and wire brushing. On the left, into the milling machine, man, wood is so much easier to mill than steel. And then on the right, I'm fitting the parts together. And here you see the raw oak forms with the revolver cylinder parts that become the rose window on the left, and the image on the right then shows the wood after it's painted blue and silver leafed. And this is a detail of the finished piece, Collateral Cathedral: forge welded decommissioned handguns, steel, wood, silver leaf, and an 18-karat gold rivet. Since I'm assuming that most of you are jewelers, I thought it best to close with a piece of jewelry. I ended 2019 and began 2020 at the week-long Smitten Forum residency, which was held at the Pocosin School of Arts in Columbia, North Carolina. These are my bench notes on the left-hand side, and on the right is a finished brooch, forged perforated steel and 18-karat gold. So I often ask myself, why do we make things? Because sometimes it's fun to get dirty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was exceptional.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I guess we're ready for question and answers. I've got a few already prepared. The first one comes from Andy Cooperman. Morse code is a great medium to quietly introduce text to the work. Is there another reason that you use it?
Well, initially, like I said, started to use it just for the design element. I just love those little squares and rectangles. It's a lot of what, Cappy was talking about with her work, what she likes to look at, different windows. I mean, I love, factory windows and things like that, where you've just got this series of squares and rectangles. So, yeah, so mostly it was, design elements, and then again, realizing that I could say things, I thought that was kind of a cool way to incorporate some kind of meaning into the work. Now, I don't expect most people to know Morse code, but it was kind of cool in that show at the Metal Museum in 2016. One of the people that attended the opening actually knew Morse code, so it was fun to have a conversation with him about those pieces.
He also asks, where does your color palette come from?
Well, I think the thing that initially attracted me to working with steel was the color of the hot rolled steel, which kind of mimics the sky about 20 minutes after the sun goes down. So I love that color palette there. But then, when I was in grad school, Brent Kington was one of the first guys that was painting forged steel. Um, and I just thought what he did with that was incredible. I mean, we never would have painted forged steel before that, I don't think. And then Haas Haley was doing a lot of that as well. And then these bright colors, I mean, like that Yellow Box series kind of began from the first time I went to Penland. You go through the dining hall and they had this bright yellow box that they kept the money in. And that sort of inspired that idea of making these yellow boxes. But just seeing all these different industrial colors, the safety yellow and reds and all those type of things, I thought it was a nice way to contrast some of the, just the pretty stark color palette of just the forged steel, the blacks.
Excellent. Kirk Lang asks, your work has a beautiful simplicity to it, yet also has a rawness where the work of the hand is evident in the final piece. How do you go about maintaining that balance, and is it a conscious decision?
Yeah, it is definitely a conscious decision. I think the pieces that I make are sort of a reflection of what I would like to be like, just this everything pared down to its essential elements. But when you look at my desk, which thankfully you can't see, there's just stuff everywhere, and my studio is full of things. So I think making the work like that is a way for me to kind of be what I really would like to be, just getting that thing down to its essential elements. And I think a lot of that too is inspired by looking at a lot of Japanese and different Asian aesthetic, cricket boxes and just the beautiful lines, and, nothing else is added in there that needs to be in there. So yeah, just the stark beauty is just, yeah, it's a nice way to put that. I actually had somebody once talking about my work, and they referred to it as like a warm industrial look. And I kind of like that idea as well.
Yeah, something approachable and yet bigger than.
And the work is really tactile. Unfortunately, here we can't pick up the things through the computer screen, and at a lot of openings, you're not supposed to touch the work either. But usually I would try to encourage people to pick it up, because it's surprising how heavy the work is and just how cool those textures feel in your hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got another question from Ine. Ine asks, how has quarantine changed your studio practice?
Well, I work in my studio by myself, so it honestly hasn't changed too terribly much as far as my daily routine in the studio. Um, the thing that it has changed is, obviously there was no live teaching going on. So I was scheduled to teach at Penland with my great friend and basically my brother, Daniel Soto from Venezuela. So that obviously was canceled, and I was going to teach at Haystack, and I was so looking forward to coming to Seattle. So, obviously the travel has gone down, but I've been fortunate to still have some commissions to work on. And the thing that I really miss too, and I think a lot of us maybe found that we did miss or do miss during this, these unsettling times, is just, particularly at the beginning of quarantine and lockdown, when you go, it's just those little daily interactions that you'd have with somebody, something simple like running into somebody, at the gas station, or, when you go to your favorite restaurant to have lunch or something, you just have these really nice, quick moments of conversation. And I think those are the things that I've missed the most, is just these little interactions that when you work by yourself, it's just something that really kind of brightens your day. And it's meaningful, those things. So I really miss those.
When you're working with something like the threaded rod or the pipe that you're splitting open and forming, where do you find that sort of play with sort of constructed materials, or already things that already have an identity?
I think kind of going back to the forged perforated steel, I think it's easy to, and it actually kind of goes back to the basis of forging. Forging by definition is altering the cross section of the material. So you take a 1-inch round bar off the rack and you hammer that into shape so it's no longer a 1-inch round cross section. And so I think the thing that I was attracted to was, what else can I do with this material? I mean, anybody can pull that perforated steel off a rack and weld it into place, but I saw the potential for much more than that by squishing it, this way or this way, or layering more pieces on top of it and forge welding it. So just, starting with something that you find, and then can you alter it to make it a little more interesting? I think a lot of times a found object is perfect just the way it is, and you shouldn't mess with it at all. But sometimes, you can manipulate it and make it a little more interesting. And that's what I hope that I'm able to do with some of these pieces, like the perforated steel or the threaded rod, by cutting it open, flattening it out, and then chiseling across those threads to create a different pattern and texture than what was initially there. And sometimes it's honestly just laziness. I mean, it's just fast, you cut this thing open, and everything we do, or everything I seem to do, is so time consuming. And so if you can create a texture fairly quickly, then I think that's a nice thing to be able to do.
Another question from NA is, I'm admittedly biased, but I love when you play in the tiny, shiny format. What drives you to make jewelry? And do you have any on your bench now?
I do have some brooches that I started working on when I got back from Smitten Forum, and then kind of put them aside. I love the interplay between scale. So I like working on a 7-foot long sculpture and then, working on a small piece of jewelry, because in all actuality, a 7-foot piece, I'm still giving that the same attention to detail as I would a piece of jewelry. I saw at one of the snag conferences a couple years ago, one of the emerging artists talked about how that they were forever a jeweler who doesn't make jewelry. And I felt like that for a long time. I started out in undergraduate school, sculpture, and I also did a lot of jewelry work. And it's something I'm more interested in now. I don't know if it's as I get older or just, I just see, I think part of it, I get really envious going to the snag conferences, and I see everybody with their beautiful pins on, and, their jewelry, earrings and necklaces. And, I'm like, I can't really carry this box with me. Like, hey, guys, I'm here, what do you think? So I love the idea of making some wearables. So I'm sure that more wearable things are going to be happening on my bench in the studio soon.
Excellent. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Excellent. Our next talk will be Maria Ify, and we'll be back at 11 o'clock. See you all then.
Bye-bye. Thank you.